Welcome to 15.2, the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Americas. Spanish settlers and missionaries followed conquerors into the Americas, and they built colonies and created a culture that blended European, Native American, and African traditions. By the mid-1500s, Spain's empire reached from modern California to South America, and the Spanish monarch appointed viceroys or representatives who ruled in his name. They closely monitored Spanish colonies and managed their valuable raw materials. Conquistadors received what we call encomiendas, or the right to demand work from the Native Americans. But under this system, Native Americans were forced to work such brutal conditions that they faced disease, starvation, and cruel treatment caused by extreme overwork. So this decline in the Native American population caused the conquistadors to have to look elsewhere for labor. A priest named Bartolomé de las Casas begged the Spanish king to end these abuses towards the Native Americans, and so a law was passed in 1542 that banned the enslavement and mistreatment of Native Americans. But the Spanish were far away, and they were not able to enforce those laws. Some landlords forced people to become what we call peons, P-E-O-N-S, which means paid workers who are basically paid before they work, and so they're always in debt to the person who is hiring them. There was still an extreme labor shortage, and so colonists brought over millions of Africans to work as slaves. This blending of diverse cultures resulted from the many different peoples that were brought to America. The Native Americans contributed the style of buildings, food, and arts, and the Spanish introduced Christianity and the use of pack animals, especially horses, and the Africans introduced farming methods, crops, and also arts. However, society in the colonies was very highly hierarchical or strictly structured. At the top, you have the peninsulares, who are people who were born on the Spanish peninsula but immigrated to Central or South America. And these were the highest on the hierarchy. The next you have the Creoles, which are still, they are purely European, but they are American-born descendants of the Spanish settlers. Then below that you would have the mestizos and the mulattoes. The mestizos were people of Native American and European descent, and the mulattoes were people of African and European descent. At the bottom you had the Native Americans and the African slaves. But Portugal too had an empire in South America. With colonies in Brazil, Portugal granted large land grants to noblemen who sent settlers to develop this area. As in the Spanish colonies, Native Americans in Brazil were almost completely wiped out from disease. Brazil's leaders also used African slaves and forced Native Americans to work as slaves as well. A new culture emerged which blended European, Native American, and African traditions in Brazil. In the 1500s, wealth from the Americas made Spain and Portugal two of Europe's most wealthy and powerful countries. And pirates often attacked these treasure ships that were coming from the New World. Some pirates called themselves privateers because they had the support of their own nation's monarchs. Spanish settlers and missionaries followed the conquistadors to the new empire in the Americas, and they established colonies and imposed new governments that were accountable to Spain. And these new colonies created a culture that mixed the different cultures that were brought together. So that would be the Native Americans, the Spanish, and the African slaves that were brought to work in these new colonies. But Spain divided its colonies, or its conquest, into 4 different areas. First you had the Mexico City area, which controlled Central America, and then you had another headquarter in what is today Colombia, and then another one down here in Lima, Peru, and then a final one in the Caribbean on Cuba, or on Hispaniola over here. And these four different headquarters kind of ran their territory, and they were headed by a viceroy who was a representative of the king in that territory. One of Spain's main goals was to spread Christianity in their territories, and so oftentimes church leaders would also have political authority, and this was mainly because they didn't have enough leadership, so they would ask the church to help with the leadership. And the church also sent over missionaries who baptized thousands of Native Americans. And they created missions that tried to bring new technologies and new ways of doing agriculture into the colonies. They also built huge churches, and they taught the Spanish language, and they introduced European clothing and crafts to these new areas. Spanish colonies practiced something called mercantilism, which is where they try to control the trade and contain the trade within the area that is controlled by a single country. So the English tried to control and maintain trade only with other English colonies and England, and Spain wanted to control its trade and keep its wealth within its own national borders. So Spain closely controlled the trade throughout its empire. So colonists could only export their raw materials that they were producing to Spain, and they could only buy Spanish manufactured goods, and they were not allowed to trade with other European nations. However, that was sometimes not upheld too closely, because Spanish manufactured goods were really kind of rubbish. So most of these countries really wanted English manufactured goods or goods from the Netherlands. Spanish colonies were exporting sugarcane. That was the main industry. And this became very highly profitable. But the Native Americans that they had been using on the colonies were unable to maintain the amount of work that was having to be produced, and a lot of them were dying from diseases that they had no immunity to. And so the encomienda owners began to import slaves from Africa. An encomienda is where a Spanish nobleman or a Spanish adventurer is given basically a special dispensation or a deed by the Spain's king to own a bit of land in the New World, and all the Indians that are found on that land are required to work for that man. The conditions on these encomiendas were extremely brutal. There was a lot of disease and starvation. The people who owned the encomienda had no interest in maintaining the population, didn't care about the Native Americans, and so they quickly died out. One of those that observed what was going on in the encomienda system and really, really disapproved of it was a man named Bartholomew de las Casas. And he originally was a conquistador himself, but decided to become a priest and chose to write about the conditions that he saw. He wrote to the King of Spain and asked him to make laws to limit the atrocities that were going on in the Caribbean and North and South America. And the king actually did create new laws to help protect the Native American population, but they were mainly disregarded because it was just too profitable to keep them in a state of slavery and misery. So, but De las Casas actually supported the idea of bringing over slaves from Africa because he said they were more hardy and could more easily bear the burden of the work that was being required of them. And they also had immunities to European diseases because of the frequent contact that Africa had had with Europe. And this made them ideal slave labor for the New World. The Spanish first brought over Africans to the Americas in the 1530s, and millions were forced to work as slaves in the fields and mines and in the households of Spanish landowners. Europeans, Africans, Native Americans all mingled together to create a new Spanish colonial culture. Food, religion, clothing, dancing, farming techniques, all of these were brought together and created a new and interesting blend of cultures. And one of the distinctive things about this culture was its hierarchy. At the top you had the Peninsulares, which were people who were born in Spain, and under them were the Creoles, who were American-born descendants of these Spanish settlers. And then below them were the mestizos and mulattoes, who were Native Americans or Native American and European mix, or African and European mix. So at the bottom of the chain were the true-blooded or unmixed Native Americans or unmixed Africans. Of course, no one today thinks that this is an appropriate way to look at people and to grade their worth. Well, the Spanish settlers lived in towns and cities, and they even established universities. And the cities were lively centers of commerce and culture and government. One of the main examples would be Mexico City, which is one of the largest speaking. Well, in 1550, when they had established Mexico City as one of the capitals of the New World, Mexico City was one of the largest Spanish-speaking cities in the world at that time. Also, the University of Mexico was established in 1551 and is one of the first universities in the Americas. Portugal claimed an empire in the eastern part of South America, and they named this area Brazil. Brazil was based on the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. But in the 1530s, Portugal really began to initiate more development in this area. And so they began issuing grants of land to Brazilian noblemen. And in return, these nobles agreed to develop the land and to share the profits with the crown. Unlike the Spanish colonies, though, Brazil did not have a lot of gold or silver, which was a great disappointment to the Portuguese. But the early settlers began to cut down Brazilian wood, which they used to make a very valuable dye out of. And landowners then began to create plantations and cattle ranches, and they really depended heavily on slave labor. At first, they turned to the Native American population, but because of the depopulation that was going on, they eventually had to turn again to African labor, slave African labor. And at this point in time, if you go to Brazil today, almost all Brazilians have a large percentage of their ancestry was African, based on the huge amounts of African slaves that were imported during this time. So Brazil's culture emerged as a blend of Portuguese, Native American, and African cultures. Of course, the amount of success that Portugal and Spain had made other countries extremely jealous. And so one of the ways that they fought back was to support privateers who would prey on the ships that were going back and forth between South America and the Iberian Peninsula, which contained Spain and Portugal. So these privateers were government-approved pirates, basically, who would attack Portuguese or Spanish ships and steal all their gold that they were transporting. And of course, this frustrated Spain and Portugal to no end, but it was one of those political problems that would only be solved with aggressive warfare, and they were not willing to go to war about that issue yet. Well, the European explorers continued to sail to the coasts of America, and they also were hunting for something called the Northwest Passage.